Welcome to Cake on Tuesday, where we spotlight the rule breakers, the underdogs who refuse to listen when everyone said it won't work. I'm Elizabeth Bieniek, and for the next 20 minutes, we're diving into another disruptive innovation story that proves sometimes the craziest ideas change everything. Today's guest is Monica Marquez. As the founder of FlipWork Inc., she is on a mission to humanize AI. After more than 20 years in workforce transformation at companies like Google, EY, Bank of America, and Goldman Sachs, Monica founded her current company to work with Fortune 500 companies, helping their employees successfully adopt AI at every level, a much-needed challenge. She also shares actionable insights in her weekly newsletter, which I love the name, AI. She is helping today's organizations leverage AI to scale their existing talent and not replace it. Monica, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I appreciate you sharing your platform with me and love to be here and ready for the conversation.
Awesome. All right, let's jump right in. Can you start off by telling us a little bit about what sets your soul on fire about this mission to humanize AI?
So I guess long story short, I've spent my career at the intersection of people, performance, transformation, and I led people-related work at firms like Goldman Sachs, Google, EY, Bank of America, and it really focused on how do you scale high-performing teams and, change how people actually work, not just the org charts and tools and all that kind of stuff. And so what I'm really passionate about and super excited about, what stokes me, is that FlipWork is essentially the product of that journey. We focus on what it really takes for organizations to become what we like to say agentic enterprises, where people and AI are truly working as teammates and that the culture and workflows keep pace with the technology. Because at the core of it, it's people. And I think what most people have forgotten over the last couple of years in this AI revolution is behaviorally, how do you help people change as fast as AI is requiring them to change? I mean, we're humans, our brains are wired for change, but slow evolution of change, and AI is throwing everyone for a loop because how quickly it's changing. The speed of change is something that we just can't wrap our brains around.
Right. And to that point, I mean, there's obviously a thread that you've seen going through your career here, and now AI is accelerating some of the work that you've done and those transitions you've seen in the past. But I'm guessing 10-year-old Monica didn't think this is what she would be doing at this time. So can you talk to us a little bit about that journey of what in your previous corporate work really planted the seeds for what you're doing now?
Yeah, you're right. As a young Latina growing up in West Texas, I mean, I was the oldest daughter of a very traditional Mexican-American family. I had two younger brothers, and I had a limited frame of reference, right? In the small town of West Texas where I lived, oil was a big thing. And so the successful people were doctors, lawyers, petroleum engineers. And so I was going to grow up to be a doctor. And I was also very involved in high school. I was in choir and stuff. So I was going to be the singing surgeon. I get to college.
Even had branding.
Yeah, exactly, right? And I got to college and I realized there's so much out there that I just wasn't aware of. I had this limited frame of reference. And I still, because growing up and conditioned that I was going to be the doctor, I got my bachelor's in biology, my minor in organic chemistry. I was applying to the med school. And I had this very amazing mentor. He was the vice president of student affairs. And the reason I got to know him is because, I had to work my entire 4 years in college. So I did a work-study job in the office of the vice president for student affairs my entire 4 years. And I was very involved on campus, the Hispanic Student Society. I was in the student government. I was a student representative on all of these boards and stuff like that. And he stopped me one day, before graduation. He's like, Monica, help me understand why you want to be a doctor. And no one had ever asked me that question. And I was like, because my parents want me to be a doctor. I want to be successful. It's all I've ever known. He's like, yes, but why do you want to be a doctor? And I couldn't answer that question. And so I remember going back to my dorm room kind of thinking oh my God, why do I want to become a doctor? And then he told me, he's like, I've watched you grow these 4 years and all of the things that you've been involved with have to do with, your engagement with students and the administration and, your voice and helping make sure that the students' interests were being met and all of these things. And he was like, you have a natural affinity to all of these things. He was like, have you ever considered getting your master's in higher education administration, student development theory, adult learning. And I was like, no, like I don't. He's like, because you've been doing that. And so that was my kind of like the fork in the road of like, do I want to do that? And so I remember thinking long and hard and talking to my parents, and my parents were like, Mija, do whatever makes you happy. We want you to just be happy and successful. And so I remember thinking, you know what, I'll just apply to that program. And if I get in, whichever one I get into, I'll do. Well, I got in both. And then I was like, okay, well, what do I do? And I finally was just like, listen to my heart. What did I love doing? What were the things that I enjoyed the most in my 4 years of college? And I realized that it was all the extracurricular activity, all of the student boards and the things that I was doing. And when I really thought about my biology classes, my physics classes, my organic chem classes, I'm like, they were like, I did okay in them, but I wasn't like getting up in the morning to do that. I was getting up to do all of the other things I was doing. So I ended up pursuing that completely different path. And before I knew it, after my master's, I packed up my bags, I moved to New York City, and I started doing all of this work and, tapped on the shoulder to work in corporate America. And I never looked back. And so it kind of, in a weird way, not really fell in my lap, but I had a really important person stop me in that moment and ask me that question of the why. Why are you doing what you're doing? And really having me reflect. And so I learned that valuable lesson early on, and reflecting and really kind of going from there.
Yeah. It really speaks to the value in mentorship too, and how wonderful to have gotten that question and reflection in your teens or early 20s. Many of us don't face that question until the second half of life. We're like, wait, what do I really want to do?
Exactly,
What's it
yes.
called to do?
I'm forever grateful.
So as you started then out on this new journey, this is pre-AI explosion of the last few years. So how has that changed your work?
It was one of those things where, ironically, I'm seeing a lot of through lines because my early work in corporate America, like first 10 years, first decade or so, was very heavy in diversity and inclusion, working on really trying to help individuals or help organizations bring a diverse slate of talent that they don't typically ever, identify, only because I was a perfect example. I grew up in a small town, West Texas, wasn't really exposed to Wall Street, big corporate, those types of things. I had a limited frame of reference, but there was some really smart individuals and people at organizations I worked at, like Goldman, who were starting to realize that companies, and I'm dating myself, but back then you started thinking about emerging markets, and they were going into other countries, and they were realizing that their analysts and their people, their bankers, whoever it was doing the work, weren't culturally competent in the kind of cultural nuances of those, those communities and those people in those countries, that if they wanted to do business, they needed to really understand the culture. And so how do you help people become more inclusive and open-minded and really thinking about, those things? Yes, you can train a non-native to be culturally competent, but wouldn't it be even better if you were to bring people from those backgrounds, in, and they do that work, and then you can kind of create more business. So the reality is this whole DEI word that is now a dirty word or a bad word that people don't like to say, it really started off with a true business case of like, how do we do more business in these emerging markets, or even in the US, markets, tap into markets that are culturally diverse. And so the idea is that, you bring in this diversity of thought so that you can gain more market share. And so the same thing I'm seeing even in this AI kind of trend of AI is being trained and developed by sets of people. Right now, there's early, warnings of like there are very few women in AI, a few AI like programmers, coders, and things like that. Who is it being coded and trained by? The beauty is that AI also needs to be trained by the user. So, closing some of that, like that gap of making sure that you as a user are bringing in your perspective and you're checking it for any kind of bias or any types of things. You can train the tool yourself, but it's one of those things we have to be really cognizant of like, that diversity of thought to bring in the most robust thinking, the creativity, and all of those things. And so there's lots of through lines where I'm seeing that play out, where we're, I think, a little bit more aware to see how sometimes, this groupthink, or if you have like, this where you start introducing bias, that people are a little more aware of like, oh, we've got to check for that. So that's a good news. But the one thing that I'm seeing is The bigger gap that's happening with the digital divide with AI is the psychological safety of where some people in organizations don't feel they have permission to start using AI to do their work differently because they may have a manager or leader who's skeptical of AI and pushing back and not knowing whether or not they should be using AI. And so you have sometimes these middle managers who are kind of putting maybe too rigid of boundaries or not even talking about boundaries so people aren't wanting to use it. But then you have senior leadership saying, we have to adopt to AI or we're going to get left behind. So it comes down to the people again, to the behavioral kind of psychology, to the safe spaces for the psychological safety to have permission to test and learn and all of those types of things. So I think, it all comes down to humans and how humans are going to leverage AI and always having AI in the loop. I mean, human in the loop with AI. And so I think, there's just over the course of the years, everything I've worked on, I feel like has come to this really cool, just like ikigai thing of like, what are you passionate about? What do you love doing? What can you get paid for what you're doing? And it's all coming to culmination with FlipWork.
So you found the center of the Venn diagram there.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about this at an organization, what does that look like? One thing, you use the phraseology in some of your correspondence about AI adoption that sticks workflow by workflow. And I like that description. I have an idea of what I think you mean by that, but I'd love to hear, what do you mean by that?
What we mean by that is a lot of the questions we get from leaders that are coming to us, or like, I just have a deep community of colleagues who now are at lots of other companies. But the feedback that I get is like, we get it. We know AI is here. It's not a matter of if, but when, it's going to impact us. We don't know where to start. And it's like, you have to start somewhere. And the easiest thing to think about is start with a workflow. Identify a simple workflow that you do yourself to get some of your work done or that your team needs to do. And think about, how do you reinvent that workflow with AI in mind? And really starting to map out, what are the steps, each individual task that you're doing, and where can AI alleviate and really kind of maybe exponentially be more efficient for you? And where do you need to make sure the human's in the loop? And so that's why we say workflow by workflow. You really have to kind of test the full workflow, because right now what we're seeing is people have this misconception of like, oh yeah, we are using AI. I'm using AI to help me draft my emails. I'm using AI to take meeting notes. That's surface level, right? Like, how are you actually leveraging it to really reinvent the workflow and really kind of start to impact the KPIs and the bottom line for your organization? And that is really kind of stepping back and looking at your workflow to say, where's the friction that we're seeing? Where does all of our time go where we feel like it's even zapping and wasting some of our time because we're doing it in a very clunky manual way, where maybe AI could help us make that more efficient? And where do we need to layer in the human and layer in what I like to say, your authentic intelligence, right? There's the artificial intelligence, but you take that output and you overlay your expertise, your discernment, just the knowledge that you have gained over the course of the years of, what is that taste? You have a taste, a special taste that you're going to overlay, which is your authentic intelligence. So the output comes out and it's very unique, and it's not what some are labeling work slop, right? You do have people who are taking that and just for face value and putting it out there. And it's, and people can tell, like, this is AI generated. There was no thought put into it. And that's the critical thing now. The biggest kind of currency and the high value currency is, was there thought leadership put into this AI? Did you bring your authentic intelligence into the output so that it makes it uniquely you? And so that's where we try to tell people, hone into your zone of genius. What is your sweet spot, and where do you kind of, just plug yourself into those processes? So it's workflow by workflow. Really start small with one workflow. Once you start to see the benefits and the efficiency that comes out of that, how do you start applying it to even a more complex workflow and the handoffs and all of those things?
Okay. So I love a good story. I'm an applied learner. Is there any examples you can share of maybe where for a client this really clicked and it made sense, of the aha moment of, wow, if we go to a level deeper and embed this into our workflows, this is what this can unlock?
Yeah, I mean, there have been several cases where we've talked to a plethora of some. One of the simplest ones was, I started off in my career in recruiting and diversity recruiting. I was heading up diversity recruiting, and I know how difficult it can be when you have a job description, you put it out there, and, back in the day, you would get candidates coming in and you could easily tell, like, yes, no, this person, like, based on their resume doesn't match or whatever. Now, candidates are using AI to kind of tailor their resume, tailor their introduction letter, right? They're like to match the job description. So the crazy thing is, there was the advancement of we're like, oh my gosh, now there's this tool that will help us match. And all of a sudden it would say all of these resumes that people have uploaded, these 100 match, have a 50% match to the job description. These have 100, whatever it might be. So you had kind of these smaller numbers where you're like, okay, I can sort through really quickly 100 and kind of get my pile of 10 that I'm going to call and screen live. The crazy thing is now with AI on the other side, now you're getting thousands of people who are matching the job description. So it's just like, how are we going to get through all of these things? So it's like, well, you use AI now to really kind of start doing some of the screening. And so it was one of those things where you make your AI smarter to kind of say, okay, take a look at the real resume and look at the job roles and like really kind of help us assess who is really a match. But the other key thing is that one of these, it was a smaller organization that was a little bit more, I would say, progressive in what they wanted to try was, why don't you have AI interview the interview calls? Like their first screening call is going to be with an AI avatar, and be very open to these people to say, like, you're going to have a video call, but it's going to be with an AI avatar that's going to ask you the same, these questions so that we better understand the depth of your knowledge. And so there were some people who were skeptical and saying, no, I don't want to interview. And we're like, okay, well, you self-selected out, so maybe you aren't as qualified. But then too, the others, what we found was there were some pros and cons, right? Some people were like, I don't trust the tool. But others, what we realized was that now you have this impartial, unbiased avatar that's asking the same exact questions to the people to get them to, answer about their experience, ask those general questions of like, give us an example of when you had, a problem, how did you solve it, all of those types of things. But it was getting rid of the bias of like, oh, you're in the same sorority I was in. Oh my gosh, we went to the same school. Oh my gosh, I like you. I'm going to push you through, right? And it was one of those things where we were now seeing that this was a really unbiased way of kind of doing the first screen call, saying, yes, this person knew what they were talking about. No, they didn't. Let's score their answers. And it was helping the recruiter not having to do 100 screen calls that they weren't going to be able to handle anymore. So it's those little things of where they're starting to use it, where then now the human in the loop is like, now the handoff was with a real person, and a real person going through, looking at the SKUs. And in some cases, it took a while for this to say, did the AI avatar interview nicely? Like, we need to go back and watch those videos. And so sure, it's painful at the very beginning to kind of like do the checks and balances and find like, yeah, like all it did was ask the question and let the person talk. And so it's mainly the person talking, and we can kind of now assess whether this person really is experienced and knowledgeable and able to communicate very well of what their, area of expertise is. And so those are kind of examples of where you're starting to see AI even creating a bigger problem, and then how do you use AI to solve that problem, on the other side. So it's interesting, how you can do that. A really more public, I guess, example is, and it's not ours, but I was at a conference and there was a leader talking about how IKEA leveraged AI on their customer service spot. And so rather than getting rid of all of their customer service reps, they retrained those reps into a more creative role that AI couldn't really do for them, which was more like room interior designer, room kind of like coordinators, right? Or like advocates that would help people with designing rooms. And so they basically retrained those people because AI was doing a lot of the upfront kind of customer service, answering questions, those types of things. But what they found is over the course of the year, IKEA brought in is something crazy, like millions of dollars more in revenue because of the people who now in this design role were basically taking people's ideas of what they wanted for a room and able to translate it and give them what they wanted. And people were buying more product because they were buying into the kind of design that the people were creating for them. So you can kind of see where AI may be replacing some roles, but how do you upskill and reskill people where you can really increase the bottom line without reducing headcount, just being more strategic and where you're putting the individual to use more of their thought leadership or their zone of genius or the creative kind of judgment discernment thing.
Okay. I'd like to hear your thoughts on applying that to celebration, because this is the Cake on Tuesday podcast. We talk about the very human characteristics of communicating, collaborating, and celebrating. I like your phraseology of saying your authentic intelligence and combining that with your artificial intelligence. How do you see this playing out to really bring those very human qualities of celebration into the workplace going forward?
That's such an amazing question because we are human, right? And we crave connection, right? It's one of the 6 human needs, right? Like there's love and connection, there's, significance and, you always want to add value and contribution and things like that. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, we saw that, during COVID where people were craving that connection and we saw a lot of people feeling lonely and disconnected, even though you were doing work and all of those things. And so I do think that there is still something that we have to figure out of how do you still foster and create opportunities of connection. Yes, there's always the video connection and things like that, but how do you create opportunities where you can bring your people together? And I think that's where companies are going to have to be more strategic in thinking about that. I mean, even us at FlipWork, by nature, we still are very kind of remote in a sense of working with people working all over the place. But because we're not having to spend operational dollars on having a brick and mortar place, we can now every quarter create a place where everybody flies or comes to one place where we create connection and community and things like that, where people feel like they can deepen the relationship. And to be honest, I feel like for me personally, I feel like that is even more beneficial because we're doing that with intention and we're building deeper connections and relationships with intention, opposed to just the water cooler talk and you passing someone, at the desk and things like that. I can't, if I really am being honest and I look back over the course of my career, there's probably over a handful of people that I truly became friends with at work. I had a lot of acquaintances and colleagues, but I didn't become friends with a lot of people because there weren't opportunities to have real deep kind of connection and things like that, except for maybe the annual kind of team retreat or something of the sort. But if you are being more intentional now to where it's just like every quarter, trying to bring people together because they work remotely or things like that, you don't forget about that. And I think that's the biggest thing that you've kind of surfaced is that we can't forget the human celebration. How do we make sure we're celebrating in that way? How can we be creative in celebrating in that way? And for some, they'll say, well, we can't. We have too many people. We can't bring them together. Well, you can do different things, right? You can leverage technology to celebrating. I mean, I remember during COVID, we would send kind of like little, mugs of coffee or hot chocolate or something. And then we would all have a coffee together, but we would use the same mug and the chocolate. And it was kind of like a coffee tasting event, but in talking about that and connecting in different ways. So you have to be creative, but you can't forget the human part of it. And I think that's the one thing that I'm glad you brought that up because I think that's what people are afraid of with the AI. When people are starting to think about how AI is replacing people and there's more touch points with artificial intelligence, where I get so frustrated when I get on the phone and I get the automated call and it's like, hello, how can, and it's like, press 1. And I'm like, agent. Like, I want to talk with someone live. We're never going to get rid of that. We're humans. And so we can't forget about that human connection. And if we do, you're going to see the pushback eventually.
Yeah. I love the idea of focusing on up-leveling the quality of the connection.
Yes.
And focusing on that over quantity. And I think that makes a lot of sense, especially in the current hybrid, disconnected world that we're working in. Monica, thank you so much for being here. Before we wrap up, where can people learn more about you? What are you most excited about next? What's coming down the pike? And where can people follow you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can easily be found on LinkedIn. It's just Monica Marquez. I have a website. It's called themonicamarquez.com. And I have a weekly newsletter that goes out and it's called AI, which is kind of an homage to my Latino heritage and really to to my grandmother. A couple like last year when I kicked it off, I was home for the holidays and she was asking me what I was doing and I told her I was pivoting for my old company and I was starting to work on, this thing, artificial intelligence and technology. And both she and one of my tias was like, ay, ay, ay. They were like, because I was talking something they couldn't grasp. And I'm like, oh my God, ay, 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 AI. That's perfect. But that's a weekly newsletter and it tries to humanize AI by talking about what are we seeing in the trends. There's sections on, how you can start testing AI for yourself. It really kind of gives you step-by-step prompts and tools that I've tested out that might be of interest to the reader. So it's a weekly email that just kind of helps you become more familiar with, testing and learning and kicking the tires on these AI tools.
Love that. All right, subscribe, y'all. You're never going to find an AI newsletter with a better title than that. Monica, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for joining another Cake on Tuesday celebration of beautiful disruption. Please share it, review it, and find more innovative stories at podcast.cakeontuesday.com. I'm Elizabeth Bienik. Be bold, stay curious. Now go have some cake.